In the previous episode, we spoke about how the Renaissance humanist revival of classical learning, the books of pagan, Greek, and Roman writers, poets, and philosophers, eventually undermined the cultural, religious, and philosophical foundations of Western society. What we didn't speak about was the content of the books the Renaissance humanists were so keen on reading. What was in those books? And how exactly did they undermine Western society? Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. First, some background. By the year 395 CE, the Roman Empire had grown so vast and unmanageable that it was divided into two. A Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church, and a Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, at the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church. In the year 476, less than 100 years later, the Western Empire was overrun by German invaders, and only the Eastern Empire was left. Almost 1,000 years later, in 1453, the Eastern Empire also came to an end, when the Muslim Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople. In the 14th century, when Renaissance humanists' obsession with classical literature began in earnest, almost no one in northern Italy knew Greek. For a long time, historians believed that Greek manuscripts began to arrive in Italy only after 1453, when Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople brought their libraries with them. But in fact, Latin scholars had been studying Greek and collecting Greek manuscripts on a small scale as early as the 8th century in the court of Charlemagne. In 1396, Coluccio Salutati, the humanist chancellor of Florence, invited the Byzantine Greek classical scholar Manuel Chrysoloras to Florence to teach Greek. The humanist Leonardo Bruni remembered this as a great opportunity. There were many teachers of law, Bruni said, but no one had studied Greek in northern Italy for 700 years. In 1433, 20 years before the fall of Constantinople, one of Chrysoloras' students, the monk Ambrogio Traversari, completed his Latin translation of Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by the 3rd century Diogenes Laertius. Lives included biographies of 81 Greek and Roman philosophers, some of whom the humanists had never heard of, summarized their teachings, and detailed 3 Hellenistic philosophies: Stoicism, skepticism, and Epicureanism. All these Hellenistic philosophies discouraged religious beliefs, which they perceived as generating unnecessary anxiety about a believer's ultimate fate. They proposed, each in its own way, to address the difficulties of human life, a life full of hope, suffering, joy, sadness, and mental anguish. They taught their adherents to achieve a state of calm contentment, a life without fears, untroubled by anxiety and sufferings, instead of worrying about their fates in a future world that might not even actually exist. They also taught that morality was not divinely commanded, but only the practical rules every society had developed over time to ensure life without conflict. Stoicism taught that people should live according to nature, that virtue is sufficient for happiness and is its own reward. A wise person should always remain calm, be emotionally resilient to misfortune, and regard emotions like anger, sadness, pity, and even joy as destructive vices. In the long term, Stoicism had only a limited influence on Western society because it's turned completely inward on the person. It attempts only to influence a person's thoughts and emotions, but it doesn't have much to say about the outside world. Skepticism casts serious doubt about whether it's possible for man, with his unreliable senses, faulty reasoning, and less than perfect judgment, to achieve absolute infallible certainty about anything, religion or nature or anything else. Skepticism is incompatible with religious belief, since a devout Christian can have no doubt that the Christian truth, as decreed by the Church, is absolutely and forever true. In the following centuries, skepticism transformed Western religious belief, scientific inquiry, societal values, and much more. Epicureanism. The last chapter of Lives of the Eminent Philosophers is devoted to Epicurus and includes a biography, a defense of him against his many detractors, and warm words of praise for his impeccable character. Why did Epicurus have so many detractors? Because he taught that pleasure is the highest good. It should be noted that even his opponents agreed that Epicurus himself had lived an admirable life, so he was not advocating a life of sensual excess, but of sober enjoyment of virtue. The world is made up of tiny, uncreated particles, atoms, that are constantly in motion, colliding with each other, sometimes bouncing off and sometimes sticking. All physical objects, including human bodies, eventually disintegrate into their constituent atoms, which can then rejoin with other atoms to form new bodies. The human soul is also a physical object, and as such dies together with the body. There is no afterlife, no heaven, no hell, so death need not be feared. If there are gods, they live lives of their own and have nothing to do with humans. There is no point in praying to them. They aren't listening, and they don't care. These beliefs are clearly not compatible with Christianity, so it's hardly surprising that the Church vigorously denounced Epicureanism. In 1417, 16 years before Traversari completed his translation of Lives, the papal secretary Poggio Bracciolini, who had some time on his hands when the pope he worked for was thrown into jail, discovered what was believed to be the last surviving copy of the didactic poem On the Nature of the Universe by the Roman poet Lucretius, which set forth the Epicurean philosophy of atheism and atomism in elegant Latin. On the Nature of the Universe is one of the more important pagan books discovered during the Renaissance, because its atomism and materialism had an outsized effect on Western philosophy and science in the following centuries. We'll be discussing the poem in detail in a later video. The Church taught that Christians should concern themselves not with this life, but with preparing for the next life. Christian life was not supposed to be calm. Christians were supposed to live in constant anxiety about their ultimate fate, heaven or hell. Even when the Hellenistic philosophies didn't actually contradict Christian teachings, they gave good Christians a second source of wisdom and morality in addition to the Christian revelation, and some good Christians had a hard time choosing between Athens and Jerusalem. So why did the Church allow these books to be copied, printed, and distributed? The answer is that Latin was the language of the Church, the language into which the Bible had been translated from Hebrew and Greek. The writings of the Church Fathers were all in Latin. Latin was the lingua franca, the common language in which churchmen of different nationalities wrote and spoke to each other. By the 7th century, Latin was nobody's mother tongue. No one learned to speak it as a child. It had to be learned in school. Unfortunately, many of the texts used to teach Latin had been written not by Christian authors, but in large part by pagan authors, who were, according to church doctrine, already in hell for all eternity because they'd had the misfortune of dying before Christ was born and so had not been saved. The Church could not disavow its Latin heritage, which remained both an asset, because it provided the Church with a language, and a burden, because that same language brought with it writings that threatened the Church's continent-wide power. On the one hand, the humanists professed to be good Christians. On the other hand, pagan philosophies also appealed to them. How were they able to believe contradictory things at the same time? It's not possible to believe, as Stoics did, that pity is a vice to be condemned, but that charity is a virtue. Or to believe, as skeptics did, that nothing can be known with any certainty, but the Church's teachings are absolutely and forever true. Or to believe, as Epicureans did, that the soul dies with the body, but that there is an afterlife, a heaven and a hell. The society in which the humanists lived was not tolerant in any sense of the word. The Church was constantly hunting down heretics and atheists and burning them at the stake. So how did humanists deal with this cognitive dissonance? There were several possible strategies. Believe both, but each in a relation to a different domain. Reason and religion don't contradict each other because religious truths are above reason. Compartmentalize. Believe both, just not at the same time. Ignore religion when working in the laboratory, and ignore reason when praying at church. Adjust each truth by ignoring the parts that contradict the other truth. Accept Epicureanism, atomism, but reject its denial of the immortality of the soul. Reject one of the truths, but outwardly pretend to accept it. Pre-modern society was a dangerous place for non-believers. These strategies make it difficult, if not impossible, to determine from a distance of so many centuries what anyone really believed. For all their commitment to change, the Renaissance humanists were not revolutionaries. They did not want to create something new, but only to restore what once was, to bring back the good old days, when all was right with the world. The irony is that by hoping to set back the clock 1,500 years, they instead opened the door to a massively different future. They couldn't have foreseen that the discovery of unimagined lands and peoples beyond the seas, the invention of printing and everything it made possible, and their spirit of doubting the received wisdom of their own day, that all these would lead to a spirit of doubting all received wisdom, to a world where there was only doubt and nothing was known for certain. Please join me in the next episode, where we'll talk about that other important event of 1453, the Gutenberg Bible, the first book produced with movable type printing technology in the West, and for future episodes, where we'll be examining in detail individual areas like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women's rights, and also why the other civilized societies of the world, Islam, China, and India, avoided the fate of the West. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up icon, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.